All right, got a question that I thought would make for a fun video. So the question is, what are the rules for gamer triggers and duty guns in your experience? Are factory choices like Glock performance triggers okay? What about Apex for the M&P? Any personal opinions about those kinds of triggers and duty guns? Well, as a matter of fact, I do have some opinions. So where I work, we buy our own guns off of an approved list. And because they're not department owned guns, but they are ours, and due to the way our policy is written, we are allowed to make changes. So, for instance, my first duty gun at this agency was a Glock 34 Gen 4. And I went and had this isn't it, but I actually did the same thing to this gun. I went and had top cocking serrations cut into the slide. And on my Glock 34, I had the slide milled because it was a non-optics cut. So when we went to dots, I had it milled for like an RMR footprint style optic. And I wanted more grip, so I silicone carbided my Glock 34 grip, and I did put an aftermarket trigger in there without any issues. So, if you look around the internet for any length of time, and it doesn't take very long, you'll come across the whole aftermarket trigger boogeyman argument for defensive or duty handguns. And I've even had this conversation with, range guys, range masters, or whatever you want to call them at other agencies, where they'll flat up tell you like, hey, you absolutely cannot, under any circumstances, put aftermarket triggers in duty or defensive handguns. Because if you do and you shoot somebody, it doesn't matter what the facts of the case are. Like the whole thing's going to be about that trigger and you're screwed. And the reality is that's just not true. It's not a thing. It's not real. So where I work, we have been like an officer purchased handgun system for decades, long before I ever came. And we've been modifying our own guns within our policy long before I ever came. And we get into like quite a few officer involved shootings every year, just like on average with the size of the department. And it has never once in the history of ever been a thing. It's not about the trigger, because the reality of the situation is the facts of the case are like, did you have the legal justification to shoot that person for X, Y, and Z reasons because of the things they were doing and they needed to be stopped, whatever. If you did, then the trigger you used is completely irrelevant. It doesn't matter. You were authorized to shoot them like you meant to. The trigger you pulled doesn't matter. And if you didn't intend to shoot them, and now it's a question of like, oh, was it the aftermarket trigger was a problem? Like, was that the problem? Or did I like accidentally pull the trigger when I didn't mean to? Did the trigger malfunction? Blah, blah, blah. Like that is a whole separate set of problems. Like you shot someone you didn't mean to, and now like you've introduced all kinds of other issues. So the reality is, like if it's a righteous shoot and like you shot them for X, Y, and Z because they needed to be stopped, the trigger you pulled just isn't relevant. And so like it has not been an issue for us at any point. And like I say, we've been in a lot of shootings and some of them have had aftermarket triggers and it's just never come up. So that whole argument of like, oh, you can't change out a defensive trigger or a duty trigger, like it just doesn't really hold water. Having said that, we do kind of govern the triggers that can go in. We're looking for aftermarket triggers that are kind of set up for duty use, or they come with a spring set that is more duty rated versus a competition rated. Something like Timney's Alpha trigger. I think it was Alpha for the Glocks, where it's like, hey, this is under no circumstance set up for duty. Like it's not rated for duty. We don't recommend it. Like something like that, we wouldn't want our guys putting in their guns. And that trigger had other issues anyway with like not reliably resetting for the competition crowd. I had a couple of them on my competition Glocks, and I didn't experience many issues, but I know most folks did. So like we do kind of look at what triggers are out there, and essentially what it boils down to is we see kind of the same list of usual suspects most of the time. So for Glocks, what we usually see is Overwatch Precision or Apex, and then for Smith & Wesson, we see the Apex trigger. And I will say that most people at our agency don't swap to aftermarket triggers, but of the ones that do, we see Overwatch Precision and Apex most often. As a matter of fact, Overwatch Precision was the trigger I put in my Duty Glock 34, and it is still, this Overwatch Precision flat face trigger is still the trigger I have in my everyday carry Glock 17. This is the gun I carried when I was undercover. I would carry this when I was in plain clothes. assignment kind of work. And then, like I say, still, this is what, like, when I'm out and about, this is the gun I carry. It's got the Overwatch Precision trigger in it, no problems. And what we're looking for basically in our aftermarket triggers that guys installs, like, we check them out and make sure essentially that, like, they're installed correctly, the trigger resets, the striker falls when it's supposed to, all the safety mechanisms are in place, and then it, like, the trigger pull, it meets kind of our above our minimum trigger pull requirements. And that's just to make sure that somebody's not walking around with something that's just like unreasonably irresponsibly light, just some like wacky 2.2 pound trigger, something like that. We don't want that. And that's one of the reasons I like Overwatch and Apex a lot, is they come with a couple spring sets when you install them. One, they come with like at least one that's like duty rated, and it gives you like a 4.3 or a 4.5 or a 4.6 pound trigger pull or whatever. And then they come with like one or two competition rated springs that maybe give you like a 3.8 or a 3.4 or something like that. And so generally, like, you stick with the duty rated trigger or the duty rated springs, no problems. I will say that we have seen, not often, but occasionally, for whatever reason, the apexes in the M&Ps, over time with the duty trigger, the springs will lighten up over time. And like when they come in for quals, we inspect the guns. We're looking to make sure nothing's broken, front sights aren't loose, dots aren't loose in their mounts, that kind of a thing. And we check the triggers, right? We're making sure that they haven't installed something that shouldn't be there, or that the triggers are not kind of ridiculously light, or that there's not a problem, right? For some reason, it's not resetting, or the striker isn't falling, whatever, right? So we just like to double check stuff when guys come to us. And occasionally, we pull on a trigger like, oh, that feels a little light. So we get the trigger pull gauge out. And on sometimes, not very often, but occasionally on those M&Ps with the Apex triggers, what was a good, duty rated above our minimum trigger pull trigger has fallen below. And it's like, okay, well, these springs need to be replaced, and we take care of that. And then they're back up and running. No big deal. As far as like the Glock performance trigger goes, I'm trying to think how many of those I've actually seen come through. I can think of one for sure, and I'm not sure about any others. But the one that came through, they shot 4-ish thousand rounds in the academy, been through a handful of quals, in-service trainings, and other things like that since then. And, no issues, ran fine. The Glock performance trigger is an OEM part. It meets all the requirements that we're looking for. I'm aware that the performance trigger requires a little more TLC than a typical Glock trigger. But like I say, the one that I'm thinking of, the one that I know I've seen for sure, did not experience any issues. Run fine, didn't have any problems. As far as like our Walthers go, like, I have an Overwatch Precision trigger in this new Walther that I've got, and I'm going to test it out and see what I think about it. I anticipate I'll like it just fine. One of the things I've noticed is it's got a little bit shorter reach than the flat faced dynamic performance trigger that comes stock in some of the pro models. The reduced reach might be kind of nice for people with little hands like me. I anticipate that I'll like this trigger just fine. I don't imagine I'll have any major issues with it. I've used Overwatch Precision triggers and Glocks a lot for a lot of years, and installed several for folks at work, and they've not had any problems either. But I will say we don't generally see folks swap out their triggers for the folks at work that run Walthers. And I imagine probably that's because the Walthers just come with such nice triggers as is. Even the stock curve trigger, kind of the standard trigger in their full size, is very good. The pro models that come with the dynamic performance trigger, or like the full send trigger, as Nick and Joel call it, is also very good. I will say that full send trigger, that dynamic performance trigger, still meets all of our duty requirements. It's above our minimum trigger pull requirement. Like, my duty Walther has that trigger in it, and it's fine. Even though it might be a gamer trigger, it still meets all the requirements for duty. It's safe. It's not unreasonably light. I think it's fine. There's no issues. In the end, I don't stress over triggers too much. I'm not a trigger snob. I know a lot of people lost their minds over the Gen 6 stock triggers in them. They're not great. They're kind of mushy. They're not as good as the Gen 5s. But if you spend enough time on them, they're fine. They're okay. If you wanted to swap them out, I think that would be fine too. I'm sure there's some other brands of triggers out there that would probably be fine for duty. I just haven't run across them, or haven't done enough research on them to be like, yep, they're good or they're not good. And I just don't know. Like, I know the tack trigger gets a lot of attention in the performance world. I know Brantley really likes his. I don't know if they offer one that would meet our duty requirements. If they did, I'm sure it would be fine. I just haven't looked into it, and to my knowledge, we haven't had any come through work to look at. But it's not to say that we won't in the future. So, yeah, those are my opinions. I think aftermarket triggers in duty guns are fine as long as they're not stupid. It's like everything else. A little bit of common sense goes a long way. And yeah, so those are my thoughts. If you've got any additional questions, drop them down below. If you want to like, share, subscribe, do all the bro stuff, that's cool. If you don't, that's all right too. So yeah, I hope that helps, guys. Take care.